"What are you doing here?" The woman who had signed away Damon Greer's career 3 weeks earlier stood frozen in the doorway of his half-gutted bakery, a lawyer at one elbow, an assistant at the other. Lydia Kincaid had come to Tide Street to see the last parcel her flagship project still needed, and found the man she had fired standing in the middle of it, a wrench in one hand, a ring of bakery keys hooked through his belt. Every last dollar he had was buried in these 4 walls. This was supposed to be his fresh start, a single father with a little girl to raise, and an old oven he meant to bring back to life. He looked at the CEO who had ruined him, and answered quietly, "I live here now." Neither of them knew the ground beneath them had been waiting years for this. 3 weeks was not a long time to lose a life and start building a new one, but Damon Greer had not been given a choice about the pace. Harbor Glen sat at the end of a 2-lane road that curled along the coast until the pavement seemed to give up and hand itself over to the sea. It was the kind of town people drove through on their way to somewhere with a better hotel. Damon had chosen it for exactly that reason. It was far. It was cheap. And when his daughter Tessa had pressed her face to the car window and seen the gray water breaking against the rocks, she had said the first happy thing she'd said in days, and that had settled it. The bakery came with the town more or less. It stood on the corner of Tide Street with its name still hand-painted above the door in letters that had faded to the color of weak tea, Rosalie's oven. The windows were papered over, the lock stuck. The realtor had described it generously as a property with character, which turned out to mean broken pipes, a rotted stretch of floor near the back wall, and wiring old enough that Damon didn't trust it with more than one light at a time. It had cost almost everything he had left, which after 9 years of steady salary and a severance that arrived like an apology no one meant, was not very much at all. He had spent those 9 years at Kincaid Foods, making sure other people's food was safe. Quality control. He was the man who read the reports no one else wanted to read, who flagged the numbers that didn't sit right, who sent the memos that made production managers sigh. He had been good at it. He had believed in the plain and unglamorous way a man believes in his own usefulness, that being right and being careful would be enough to keep him standing. Then a product launch went wrong. A whole line pulled from shelves, a story in the trade press, money lost in numbers with too many zeros to feel real, and the company needed a name to hang it on. They hung it on his. He had warned them. He had the memos to prove he'd warned them, or thought he did, and it hadn't mattered. He had been walked out of a building he'd given nearly a decade to, carrying a cardboard box, while people he'd eaten lunch with for years found somewhere else to look. He didn't tell Tessa most of that. She was 7, and she understood the important part, which was that they were leaving the apartment she'd grown up in, and that her father cried once in the car, with the radio turned up so she wouldn't hear, and that he had promised her the new place would have a real kitchen. He meant to keep that promise. That was what the wrench was for, and the borrowed ladder, and the long list taped to the wall in his own cramped handwriting. In the mornings he walked Tessa to the small school at the top of the hill, and in the afternoons he pried up rotted boards and chased a leak through the old plumbing, and learned the building the way you learn a person one stubborn habit at a time. At night he sat on an overturned crate and ate cold sandwiches and looked at the cold, dead oven at the heart of the room and let himself imagine it warm. He had been at it 11 days when the black car pulled up outside. He noticed it because nothing like it ever parked on Tide Street. It was too clean. Too quiet, the kind of car that belonged to people who were driven rather than people who drove. 3 doors opened. A man in a gray suit got out first, holding a leather folder against his chest. A younger woman followed with a tablet, and then the third person stepped out, and Damon felt the floor of his stomach drop before his mind had even finished the work of recognizing her. He knew the walk before he knew the face. He'd watched that walk cross 100 conference rooms. Lydia Kincaid moved through the world as though it had already agreed to get out of her way. She came to the papered-over window, and one of them tried the door, and Damon, because he could not think of a single reason not to, and because some stubborn animal part of him refused to hide in his own kitchen, set down the wrench and opened it. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was thin, almost without air behind it. She had stopped one step inside the threshold, and the lawyer had stopped behind her, and for a moment none of the practiced smoothness that hung around these people meant anything at all. She was looking at his face. It occurred to him distantly that she had never done that before, that in 9 years, and one firing Lydia Kincaid had never once actually looked at him. "I live here now," Damon said. The words came out steadier than he felt. He watched them land. He watched her understand that the thing she had done to him 3 weeks ago and the man standing in front of her covered in plaster dust were the same event, connected by a line she had never bothered to trace. The lawyer recovered first, the way lawyers do. He stepped up beside her and opened the leather folder and began to explain in the warm and reasonable voice of a man who has explained many things to many people exactly why they were standing in Damon's bakery. Kincaid Foods was expanding, not the plants, not the product lines, the company itself, into something the lawyer called flagship retail and community development. Tide Street had been identified as the site, the whole block eventually, a destination, he said, a showcase. The corner where Rosalie's oven stood was, he added with a small nod at the walls, as though complimenting them, the anchor parcel. They were prepared to make a very generous offer, more than generous. They would cover the full purchase price Damon had paid, and then some. They would cover relocation. They would, the lawyer said, make this easy. Damon listened to all of it. He listened the way he used to listen in meetings, letting the whole thing be said before he touched any part of it. And while the lawyer talked, he watched Lydia, who had not said another word. She was not looking at the folder. She was looking at the far corner of the room, where a child's yellow raincoat hung on a nail beside the back door, and a small pair of rubber boots sat underneath it, and a drawing of a house with too many windows had been taped crookedly to the wall at exactly the height of a 7-year-old's reach. Something moved across her face when she saw those things. He couldn't name it. He wasn't sure she could either. "You'd be doing yourself a favor," the lawyer was saying. "A property like this in this condition, the numbers don't work for a small operator. We both know that. What we're offering is a clean way out." It was a good offer. That was the part Damon would think about later lying awake. It was genuinely a good offer, and it would have solved every immediate problem he had. It would have put money back in the account he checked too often. It would have let him find something easier somewhere with fewer broken pipes, and Tessa would still have gotten her kitchen eventually somewhere else. A clean way out. He would have been able to walk away from the whole shape of his ruined year with cash in his pocket, and the small, cold comfort of having taken something from the company that had taken everything from him. He looked at the yellow raincoat. He looked at the oven. "No," he said. The lawyer's smile held professionally. "I don't think you understand the... I understand it fine." Damon set his hand flat on the cool metal edge of the work table, less to steady himself than to feel that it was solid. "You want the corner. You want it to be a showcase. I get it. But this isn't a parcel to me. I'm not selling." He looked past the lawyer at her, because she was the one who mattered, and they both knew it. "I'm opening a bakery." For the first time, Lydia spoke. Damon. His name in her mouth was strange to him. She had never used it before, not once, and hearing it now was like hearing a stranger read it off a form. "You don't have to make this hard for yourself." "I'm not making anything hard," he said. "You came to my door. I'm just the one who answered." Whatever she meant to say to that, she didn't say it. The younger woman with the tablet shifted her weight. The lawyer glanced between them, sensing correctly that the room had gotten away from him, And Lydia looked one more time at the corner with the raincoat and the crooked drawing, and then she gathered whatever she had come in with the certainty, the easy authority, the assumption that the world would agree to get out of her way, and found that some small piece of it had gone missing and would not come back. "We'll leave the offer with you," the lawyer said, laying a card on the work table. "Take a few days. These things feel different once the dust settles." They filed out. The black car was too quiet pulling away the way it had been too quiet arriving. Damon stood in the open door and watched it reach the end of Tide Street and turn and disappear, and he realized his hand was shaking, and he wasn't sure whether it was anger or something closer to fear. He picked up the lawyer's card. He read the raised letters without seeing them. Then he set it face down on the table and went back to the leak he'd been chasing when the world showed up at his door, because the leak at least was a problem he knew how to fix. What he did not know, what neither of them had any way of knowing standing in that room together for the first time in their lives, was that the ground under his feet had said no to Konsinkite Foods once before. That the woman who had owned this place before him had stood where he was standing and given the same answer for reasons he had not yet found. That the corner of Tide Street had been waiting patient as an old oven, holding its heat for someone stubborn enough to say it again. Damon didn't know any of that yet, but he was about to. The building did not want to be saved. That was how it felt to Damon in those first weeks that Rosalie's oven had made up its mind to fall down slowly and resented the interruption. He fixed the leak, and a different pipe began to weep behind the wall 2 days later. He tore out the rotted floorboards by the back door and found the joists beneath them soft with old water, and had to tear those out too, and the small job he'd budgeted 3 afternoons for ate a week, and most of a paycheck he no longer had coming. The wiring he touched only after reading everything he could find, and then reading it again, because he had Tessa asleep in the room upstairs, and no intention of learning about electrical fires from the inside. He worked with the patience of a man who had nothing left but time, and one good reason to spend it well, and the reason walked to school every morning holding his hand and came home every afternoon to ask how much more of the floor was fixed. It was while he was pulling apart the wall behind the old oven, chasing yet another draft, prying loose a board that had been nailed there long enough that the nails fought him, that his hand closed on something that wasn't brick or beam. A tin box, the kind that once held butter cookies wedged into a hollow in the wall where no draft could reach it, and no accident could have put it. He carried it to the work table and worked the lid free with his thumbs. Inside were recipes, dozens of them on index cards gone soft at the corners, written in a slanted hand that pressed hard on the downstrokes. Bread, mostly. A sourdough that took 3 pages. Cinnamon rolls with a note in the margin that just said more than you think. And underneath the cards folded twice a letter on lined paper that had yellowed along its creases. Damon almost didn't read it. It felt like opening someone's mail. But his own name was not on it, and neither was anyone's, and the first line pulled him in before he'd decided to let it. "If you're reading this," it began, "then you bought my bakery, and I want you to know a few things. The paperwork won't tell you." Her name was in the second paragraph. Rosalie Finch. She had run the place for 31 years, she wrote, and her mother had run it for 20 before that. And in all that time, it had never once been only a bakery. It was where the town came. Weddings ordered their cakes here, and funerals ordered their bread. And on the cold mornings, the fishermen stood inside the door, with their hands around paper cups, until the sun came up enough to work by. "A building is just walls," she wrote. "What I'm selling you is the fact that people come." And then further down, the part that made Damon set the letter flat on the table and read it a second time with his heart going strangely hard in his chest. A big company came for this corner once, Rosalie had written. Foods Groceries. I don't remember the whole name, only the man in the suit who kept saying the word generous. They offered me more money than I'd see in 10 years of good ones. They came back 3 times, and when saying no, didn't take, they got quieter about it. A permit that sat too long on someone's desk, a supplier who suddenly couldn't deliver small troubles that always seemed to find me right after I'd turned them down. The last time they brought a lawyer and a folder and told me the numbers didn't work for a woman my age running a place like this alone, and that they were offering me a clean way out. I told them no. Not because I'm proud, because a clean way out of the only thing you ever built isn't a favor, whatever they call it. I don't know if they'll come back after I'm gone. If they do, and if you're the kind of person who found this box because you were fixing this wall with your own 2 hands, then you already know what to tell them. Damon read the phrase "a clean way out" and heard the lawyer's warm, reasonable voice saying it in this very room 3 weeks after Rosalie Finch had written it down as a warning. He understood then. It was not a coincidence that Concentrate Foods wanted this corner. It had wanted this corner for years. Rosalie had been the thing standing in its way, and Rosalie was gone, and the company had come back the moment the ground was open, and found him standing on it, instead holding a wrench, not knowing he'd inherited a fight along with the floor. He folded the letter along its old creases and put it in his shirt pocket over his chest, and did not take it out again for a long time. Lydia came back on a Tuesday afternoon after the school day had let out. She told herself it was to close the file. That was the story she carried in with her, the same way the lawyer had carried his folder, a professional object held against the chest for protection. The Tide Street project was hers. Not the company's in the abstract way. Most things were the company's, but hers, the thing she had built the case for, the thing that had her name on the internal decks and her judgment on the line. The bakery was the anchor parcel. Anchor parcels did not get to say no. She had solved harder problems than one stubborn man with a wrench, and she had come. She told herself to solve this one. But she did not bring the lawyer this time, and she noticed that she had not brought him, and she chose not to examine why. She parked the black car at the end of the block and walked the rest, which she also did not examine. The papered windows were half uncovered now. Someone had scraped the old paper from the lower panes, and through the clean glass, she could see the room she'd stood in 3 weeks ago change the floor hole where it had been rotted. The walls patched a string of work lights running the length of the ceiling. It looked less like a ruin and more like an intention. She had her hand raised to knock when she heard the child. The girl was inside home from school, up on a step stool near a tall metal shelving unit that leaned against the side wall, reaching for something on the top. A jar, a tin. Lydia never afterward knew what reaching too far, the way children do with all her small weight going the wrong direction, and the shelf, which Damon had not yet bolted to the wall because it was on a list below the pipes, and the floor, and the wiring, began to come with her. Lydia did not decide to move. She was through the door and across the room before she'd finished seeing it, and she got a hand and a shoulder into the falling shelf and turned her body so the whole leaning weight of it came against her instead of the child. Tins and jars went everywhere. A shelf edge caught her forearm and opened a line of red across it. But the girl was on the floor and clear of it, sitting hard on the fixed boards, wide-eyed and unhurt, and the shelf was against the wall where Lydia had shoved it, and the noise of all of it was still ringing when Damon came down the stairs 3 at a time. He saw his daughter on the floor. He saw the woman who had fired him standing over her with blood running down her arm. For a fractured second, his face couldn't hold any single thing, and then Tessa said, "I'm okay, Daddy." The lady caught it, and everything in him rearranged. He got Tessa up and checked her over with a father's fast, thorough hands, and only when he was sure did he turn to Lydia's arm. She said it was nothing. It was not nothing. It was a clean, shallow cut the length of 2 fingers, and it was going to need cleaning at least, and he went for the first aid kit without asking whether she wanted him to. It was Tessa who insisted on the bandage. Damon had cleaned the cut and was reaching for gauze when his daughter appeared at his elbow, with a small box she'd dug out of her own things, and inside were the adhesive bandages, printed with yellow stars, the ones she was rationing carefully because there would be no more when they were gone. She peeled one open with great seriousness and pressed it over the worst of the cut herself, smoothing the ends down with her thumb, and looked up at Lydia to see if she'd done it right. Lydia Kincaid, who had negotiated the purchase of things worth more than this entire town, looked down at a child's star-printed bandage on her forearm and could not for a moment speak at all. Something gave way in her while she stood there. Not all at once, nothing about Lydia gave way all at once, but a seam she hadn't known was under strain finally let go. And through the gap came a question she had spent weeks not asking. She had signed the paper that fired this man. She had not read the file. She had trusted the summary and the recommendation and the man who brought them to her because that was efficient. And she had built an entire career on being efficient. And now the man she'd fired had used everything he had left to buy the one piece of ground she wanted. And his little girl had just given her a bandage with stars on it. And none of the numbers she'd been shown explained any of this. She drove back to the city that night with the bandage still on her arm because she couldn't make herself take it off. And the next morning, she went to the records that were supposed to have been the basis of a decision she'd made without ever really making it. And she asked to see the whole thing, not the summary, the whole file. What she found took several days to find because it had been well hidden, and Lydia was not a person who gave up in the middle of looking. The failed launch had a documented history, and the documented history said that the raw ingredient lot at the center of it had passed every check. But quality control kept its own records separate from the ones that fed the summaries, and buried in those was a different story. Damon Greer had flagged that lot. He had flagged it in writing twice with the specific concern that later turned out to be exactly right. His memos had gone up the chain. And then, at a particular point in that chain, they had stopped existing, deleted from the file that reached the executives, replaced with a clean record that showed no warning at all. So that when the launch failed, there was a man who had signed off on the lot, and no man who had objected to it. The point in the chain where the memos vanished had a name attached to it. Brent Mallory, her chief operating officer. The man who had brought her the summary and the recommendation and the reassuring, efficient story of a quality manager who had missed something he should have caught. The man she had trusted so she wouldn't have to read the file herself. Damon had not missed anything. Damon had caught it and warned them, and been erased for it so that the people who had approved the bad lot could keep their hands clean, and so that Brent, who had done the erasing, would never have to explain why he'd let it ship. She sat with that for a long time in an office with a view she'd stopped seeing years ago. Damon found out that the company had not given up before Lydia could tell him what she'd learned. It came the way these things come, not with a black car, but with paper. First, a letter from the town office informing him that his renovation permit was under review, and all work was to stop pending that review with no reason given that meant anything. He had pulled every permit correctly. He'd been careful, because careful was the only way he knew how to be. There was no honest reason to suspend it. 2 days after that, the bank that held the small loan he'd taken against the building's repairs sent a notice calling the terms into question language he had to read 3 times before he understood that they were looking for a way to pull it back. He was not a man who believed in coincidence anymore. He'd stopped believing in it the day he read Rosalie's letter. A permit and a loan did not both go wrong in the same week by accident. Not for the one property on Tide Street that had told Kincaid Foods no. This was the company reaching out with a quieter hand than the lawyer's folder squeezing in the places a small operator could be squeezed until staying became impossible and selling became the only clean way out. It was the same quiet trouble Rosalie had described in her letter, arriving now at his walls the way it had once arrived at hers. The old Damon The one who'd carried a cardboard box out of a building full of people who wouldn't look at him might have folded then. He felt the pull of it. He sat on the overturned crate in the half-finished room with the 2 notices in his hand and felt how easy it would be to be crushed again by people who had more of everything than he did. But he was not entirely that man anymore, and it was his own old habit that saved him from it. He had spent 9 years being the person who kept his own records because he did not trust other people to keep them honestly. Every memo he had ever sent at Concentrate Foods he had kept a copy of on his own drive, in his own files carried out of that building in the cardboard box, along with a coffee mug and a framed photo of Tessa. The warnings about the bad lot. Dated, sent, received. He had them. They had erased their copies and never once imagined that the careful man they'd erased was careful enough to have his own. He didn't have the whole picture. He didn't yet know who had pulled the permit or leaned on the bank, though he could guess the shape of it. But for the first time since he'd walked out with that box, Damon Greer understood that he was not empty-handed. He had proof, and a man with proof did not have to wait to be rescued. He was still holding that thought, turning it over, when the black car came back to Tide Street one last time. Lydia came alone. No lawyer, no assistant, no folder. She had a plain envelope in her hand, and the star bandage was gone from her arm, but the thin, healing line of the cut was still there, and Damon saw it, and knew where it had come from, and hated that he was glad she still carried the mark. She started to tell him. She got as far as I read the file, and your memos were deleted, and it was Brent before she saw that none of it was landing the way she'd carried it in, believing it would. I know, Damon said. That stopped her. I don't have the deletion. He went on, his voice level in a way that cost him something to keep. I don't have proof of what your COO did on your systems, but I have every memo I sent. I kept my own copies. I've had them the whole time. He let her understand that. I didn't need you to come here and tell me I was right. I already knew I was right. I've known since the day they walked me out. Then let me help you, Lydia said. I can bring the whole thing to the board. I have access you don't. I can make this. Make this what? He didn't raise his voice, which was somehow worse than if he had. Clean. That's the word your lawyer used. A clean way out. It's the word your company used on the woman who owned this place before me. Did you know that? She wrote it down. She's got a letter in a box in that wall, and it's your company in it, saying the exact same things to her that you're saying to me now. He shook his head slowly. You signed the paper that ended 9 years of my life, and you never read the file. You never looked at me. Not once in 9 years, until you walked through that door and found out the man you fired was standing on the parcel you wanted. And now you want to help. Now that helping me happens to be the same thing as fixing your own mistake. That's not. But she couldn't finish it because some part of it was true, and she was too honest with herself now, and far too late to pretend it wasn't. I'm not taking anything from you, Damon said. Not your money, not your help, not your access. I'll fight this myself. I've got what I need. He was wrong about that, and some quiet part of him knew he was wrong. Even as he said it, knew that his memos proved he'd been right about the lot, but proved nothing about the permit, or the bank, or the deletion, knew that the thing that could actually break this open sat inside the company where only she could reach it. But he was too raw to want to be right about it. He had spent the worst weeks of his life being small in front of people with power, and he would rather lose standing up than be saved sitting down. Lydia set the envelope on the work table in the same spot where the lawyer had set the card the first time, and she did not push it toward him. She left it there close enough that he could reach it if he ever chose to, and she went to the door. I looked at you just now, she said without turning around, for whatever that's worth, which I know is nothing. And she left. They hit the bottom that night in 2 different places, which is the only way people who are not yet on the same side ever hit it. Damon sat in the dark of the bakery after Tessa was asleep. The work lights off to save the wiring, the envelope untouched on the table across the room, like something that might go off if he got too close. He took Rosalie's letter out of his shirt pocket and read it again by the light of his phone. A clean way out of the only thing you ever built isn't a favor, whatever they call it. She had held this corner against them, and it had likely cost her more than the money she'd turned down. The years of quiet pressure, he could only guess at the stalled permits, and the suppliers who couldn't deliver all the small cruelties a company could reach through the walls of a life. She had written them down so plainly that he'd read his own week in her handwriting. She had held on anyway. And she had left the fight to whoever came next, trusting the walls to hand it to the right person. He wasn't sure he was the right person. That was the truth he sat with in the dark. He'd told Lydia he had what he needed, and he'd known it wasn't quite true. And now he was alone with a stopped permit, and a squeezed loan, and a proof that proved only half of what mattered, and a little girl upstairs who thought her father was building her a kitchen. He wasn't sure he could stand up a second time. The first time had nearly finished him. He didn't know if there was enough of him left to do it again. Across the miles in the city, Lydia sat in the black car in a parking structure and did not drive it anywhere. She had come to Damon with everything he needed, and he had refused it, and she could not blame him. And that was the part that would not let her go. She had a choice in front of her now, and she could see both ends of it clearly, the way she saw everything clearly, and had used that clarity for years to protect herself. On one side, she could call Brent. She could tell him what she'd found, let him understand that she understood, and let the two of them arrive at something quiet. A story the board never heard a COO who resigned for personal reasons, a mistake that stayed buried her own position untouched because her signature was on that firing, and Brent knew it, and a clean resolution protected them both. It would be efficient. It was, she realized with something close to nausea, exactly the kind of efficient she had built her whole career on. On the other side, the truth. Out loud to the board with her own name in it, which meant admitting she had signed a man's dismissal without reading the file, which meant the story getting out and the Tide Street project dying, and her judgment, the thing she was the only thing she'd ever fully trusted about herself, called into question in the one room where it had always been beyond question. It would cost her more than money. It might cost her the company. She sat in the dark with her hands on the wheel and did not turn the key. And she thought without wanting to about a woman she had never met who had run a bakery for 31 years and written down the word generous like a warning. Rosalie Finch had been offered a clean way out of the only thing she'd ever built, and she had looked at it and known it for what it was, and said no, and paid for it, and left the paying to whoever came after her, because she trusted that person to be brave enough. She had spent these last weeks discovering that she was the company in that letter, the man in the suit saying generous. She was the clean way out. She looked at her arm at the thin pink line where a metal shelf had opened her skin because she'd put herself between it and a child without deciding to. A little girl had smoothed a star over that cut with her thumb and looked up to see if she'd done it right. Lydia took her hands off the wheel. She did not know yet what she was going to do, but she knew for the first time in longer than she could remember that she was not going to do the efficient thing. Damon woke the next morning, still not sure he could stand up a second time, and did the only thing he'd ever known to do with a doubt that size. He went to work. Not on the pipes, on the fight. He'd spent the night deciding that a man with half the proof was not a man with none, and that the half he had was the half nobody could take from him. His memos couldn't show who deleted the record, or who leaned on the town office, or who called the bank. But they could show in his own dated words that he had warned Concentrate Foods about the exact thing that later blew up, and that alone was a story. and Rosalie's letter had already taught him what to do with a story. A building is just walls. What I'm selling you is the fact that people come. So he made them come. He started with the woman who ran the hardware store 2 doors down, who had been selling him lumber and sympathy for 6 weeks, and he told her the truth, that the company trying to buy the block was the same company that had fired him for being right, and that the stopped permit and the squeezed loan weren't bad luck. They were the same hand that had come for Rosalie Finch's corner years before. She knew Rosalie. Half of Harbor Glen had grown up on Rosalie's cinnamon rolls. By noon, the story had legs, and by the end of the day, a reporter from the county paper, a real paper small but stubborn, was standing in the half-finished bakery with a notebook listening to Damon lay it out plainly and reading with her own eyes the dated memos he'd carried out of that building in a cardboard box. He didn't exaggerate. He'd learned a long time ago that the careful version was always stronger than the loud one. He gave her what he could prove and told her honestly where his proof stopped, and he let Rosalie's letter do the rest, because a town that had loved a woman for 31 years did not need to be told how to feel about a company that had come for her corner while she lived and come back the moment she was gone. By the time the story was ready to run, it was not a story about one fired man anymore. It was a story about a town. Lydia made her choice in a lawyer's office at 7 in the morning, which was the earliest her own attorney. Her personal one, not the company's, would agree to meet. She had not called Brent. That was the whole of it, really. Every other decision followed from the one she'd made in the dark of the parking structure with her hands off the wheel. She could have called him and made it quiet. She had not. Instead, she'd spent the small hours assembling everything: the quality control records, the gap in the file where Damon's memos should have been, the metadata that showed when the clean version had been written and by whose access. And now she sat across from her own attorney and asked the only question that mattered. "If I bring this to the board myself," she said, "with my own name in it, what happens to me?" Her attorney was honest, which was why she'd hired him. It could end her, he told her. The firing had her signature on it. A defense attorney for Brent, or for the company against her, would make sure the board understood that the CEO who signed the dismissal was now trying to reframe her own failure as someone else's crime. Even if the truth held, and he thought it would, she might not survive it. The Tide Street project was finished either way, and there was no version of this where it stayed inside the building. "I understand," Lydia said. "You could still call him," her attorney said. Meaning Brent, meaning the clean way offering it, once the way a good lawyer offers his client every door. "There's a version of this where you protect yourself." "There's always been that version," she said. "I've been living in that version my whole career." She gathered the file. "I'm not calling him. Set the board meeting." The board meeting and the newspaper landed in the same 48 hours, and afterward no one could say which had forced the other, which was exactly the way the truth got out when a town and a conscience both moved at once. Lydia stood in front of the board of Concentrate Foods and did the thing her attorney had warned her might end her. She did not soften it. She told them she had signed Damon Greer's dismissal without reading the file that justified it, that she had trusted a summary because trusting summaries was efficient, and that the summary had been a lie built by her chief operating officer to bury the fact that the man they'd fired had been right. She laid the quality control records beside the doctored file. She showed them the gap and the metadata and the name that sat on top of the deletion. And when a board member asked her coldly why she was telling them this instead of handling it privately, she said that handling it privately was how it had happened in the first place, and that she was done being efficient about the truth. Brent Mallory was not in the room to defend himself, because by then the county paper had already run the story, and the board had read it, and the pieces Damon had made public, and the pieces Lydia brought to the table were the same shape and fit together without a seam. His memos, dated and real, proved the warning. Her records proved the burial. Neither half had been enough alone. Together, they left nothing to argue with. Brent was suspended before the meeting ended, and the investigation that followed would take his position, and eventually more than that, though Lydia was not in the room for most of it. The company withdrew its bid for the Tide Street block that same week, quietly the way large things retreat when the cost of advancing has changed, and issued a statement restoring Damon Greer's name, acknowledging in careful corporate language that a former employee had raised valid concerns that were improperly handled, and that the company regretted the harm done. It was not an apology in any language a human being would use. But it was on the record, and it was public, and it undid in ink the thing that had been done to him in ink. What it cost Lydia, it cost her. She did not walk away untouched, and she had known she wouldn't, and she had chosen it anyway. That was the part that mattered to her, not the outcome, which she couldn't control, but the choosing, which she could. She came back to Harbor Glen one more time, and this time there was no black car. She drove herself in a plain car she'd had for years and rarely used, and she parked at the end of Tide Street and walked the rest the way she had before. The permit was unsuspended. The town office had reversed itself the day after the story ran, with the same lack of explanation that had accompanied the suspension, which told its own tale. The bank had gone quiet. Through the clean windows, Damon's bakery looked closer to finished than she'd ever seen it. The shelving unit now bolted firmly to the wall where it belonged. She had the full file with her, the complete one. Everything the board had seen, and some things it hadn't. She had brought it because he deserved to have it, and because she had told him that last day that she was leaving something on the table he could reach if he ever chose to, and she wanted to close that, honestly. Damon met her at the door. He didn't ask her in and he didn't turn her away. "It's done," Lydia said. "The board has it. Brent's suspended. They've pulled the bid and put your name back on the record publicly. You'll have seen the statement." She held out the file. "This is the whole thing. What they saw and what they didn't. It's yours. I'm not giving it to you so you'll forgive me. I don't expect that. I'm giving it to you because it was always yours. And I'm the reason you didn't have it." He looked at the file and did not take it right away. "You could have made it quiet," he said. "Protected yourself. Your lawyer must have told you that." "He did." "Why didn't you?" Lydia thought about how to answer that honestly, which was the only way she answered things now. "Because a woman I never met left a letter in a wall," she said. "And because your daughter put a star on my arm, and because I spent 19 years being the kind of person who takes the clean way out, and I found out I was the villain in someone else's letter." She met his eyes without any of the practiced authority she'd carried through the door the first time. "I didn't do it to fix what I did to you. I don't think that can be fixed. I did it because it was true, and I was tired of not telling the truth." And this time, Damon took the file. He didn't say he forgave her. He didn't feel it, not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But he took the file, and in taking it, he let something into the room that hadn't been there before. Not forgiveness, but the possibility that it might someday have somewhere to grow. "Thank you," he said, and meant it, which surprised them both. Rosalie's oven opened on the first Saturday of the town's summer festival, which Damon had not planned and could not have planned, because the festival date was fixed, and the bakery had simply finally been ready in time, as though the building had decided, having fought him for months, to hand him this one thing. The whole town came the way Rosalie had promised in her letter that they would. They came for the smell first, which reached the street before the doors opened, and then they came for the bread, and the fishermen who'd once stood inside her door with their hands around paper cups came and stood inside Damon's and did the same. On the counter in the place of honor sat a tray of cinnamon rolls made from the 3-page recipe in the tin box from Rosalie's own slanted hand, with more of everything than he'd have thought to use if her margin note hadn't told him more than you think. They sold out in an hour. He made more. He built the rest of his life the way he'd rebuilt the floor, one stubborn board at a time. He hired 2 people that first month, and 3 more by the fall. Local people, the kind a town like Harbor Glen couldn't always keep, because there was nothing to keep them for. He started a class free on the slow weekend mornings, teaching anyone who came how to work the dough, because Rosalie's letter had said the place had never once been only a bakery, and he understood by then that she'd left him instructions as much as a recipe. It became what she'd said it always was, the place where the town came. Lydia became part of it slowly and quietly, and without any of them announcing that she had. She came on weekends at first with the wariness of a person not sure of her welcome, and Tessa, who had never carried the weight the adults carried, and saw only the woman who'd caught the shelf, took to her with a child's uncomplicated ease. It was Tessa who taught her to knead standing on the same step stool, correcting Lydia's technique with the bossy patience of a 7-year-old who knows one thing well. Lydia, who had negotiated the purchase of things worth more than the town, learned to fold dough under the instruction of a child, and was worse at it than she was at anything else in her life, and did not mind. What grew between Lydia and Damon over those weekends did not have a name, and neither of them tried to give it one. It was not what the fight had been, and it was not yet whatever it might become. It was something newer and more careful than either a warmth that had to be earned every weekend and never assumed built, the way the only trustworthy things ever get built slowly out of what's actually there. She was not forgiven. She knew that, and did not push it, and the not pushing was itself a kind of proof that she'd changed. But she was let in a little further each time, and there was a morning near the end of that first summer when Damon handed her a cup of coffee without her asking, and she understood that she had been given something, and that it was small, and that small was exactly the right size for it to be real. The bakery kept its name. Damon never considered changing it. Rosalie's oven and letters he'd repainted himself in the same weak tea color they'd faded to, because the name was the truest thing about the place, that it had been built by someone held against people who wanted to take it and hand it on to whoever was stubborn enough to keep it standing. A man's worth Damon had learned was not in the title a company gave him or took away, and not in a decision made about him by someone who never bothered to look at his face. It was in what he chose to build back out of the wreck they left him. Lydia had learned something harder, and later that the clean way out was never a favor whatever they called it, and that the only life worth having was the one you were brave enough to tell the truth in, even when the truth cost you the very thing you'd spent 19 years protecting. The oven stayed warm. The town kept coming. And on Tide Street on the corner that had said no once, and said it again, something that had nearly been destroyed twice, went on quietly becoming whole.